Okay, so I'm planning on talking about RxJS and Angular error handling or exception handling. And the code for this talk is along the bottom there if you're interested in checking it out. My name's Deborah Kurata. I'm a Pluralsight author, and I just resurrected my YouTube channel. I've had it for a while, but I just started actually using it in November, and I've got content there if you're interested. I wanted to start with just a couple of basics just to make sure we're all on the same page with some terminology. Excuse me. And then we'll jump into the exception handling. So here is a UI that we're going to be working with. We have a list of all of our users. The user is going to pick one of those users and display all of their to-dos, which helpfully are all written in Latin. And then it marks whether they're completed or not. So as we all know, Angular uses RxJS in order to issue HTTP GET requests. So we've got code in a service, we call HTTP GET, and we return that observable. In order to actually get the data, then we need to subscribe. And we can, of course, subscribe with a subscribe function with the async pipe in our template. And now with Angular v16, we'll be able to automatically subscribe with toSignal. And what that does is creates a signal from our observable automatically subscribing and unsubscribing so that we don't have to deal with that sometimes messiness that comes with unsubscribing. I know that there were several talks at this conference about signals, but if you still aren't really clear on what they are, on how you use them, I have a YouTube video about that, and also one about how to use them with RxJS along with several others. So if you're interested, and one of the few benefits of being someone with an uncommon name in tech is that you can, if you don't want to write down these links, you can just search for Deborah and Angular signals, and you should be able to find the content. Okay, lastly, when we learn how to do our observables, we learn in a procedural way where we write some kind of method. And very commonly right now is to use a declarative approach instead. And all that means is we're declaring a variable to hold our observable instead of calling a method for our observable. So all the samples you'll see here use the declarative approach. Using the declarative approach will make it a little bit easier too to work with signals, but the stuff and signals will also work with the procedural approach. And with that, we're going to jump into error handling. So why bother? Well, first of all, as we all know, errors happen, especially when calling HTTP methods such as HTTP GET, also put post and delete. It's also important to know that HTTP methods are async, at least they appear that way in our code. What I mean by that is you issue the HTTP GET request, get back the observable, the request goes off to the server somewhere, but your code keeps going. So it's not waiting for that response to return. At some future point in time, that server will provide that response, and it calls a callback function that then executes. What all that means is we can't just put a try-catch block around our HTTP GET, because that isn't what would generate the exception. It would be the notification coming back to our method that would be what would receive that error. And it's important to note too that when an observable generates an error, it shuts down, it stops, and it won't emit further. And that can be really problematic, especially if you use an action stream. And we'll talk about that a little bit later in this talk. So what are some of our options then? Well, in the service, we can catch the error. So we can catch any error coming back from our HTTP requests and rethrow them. This should then return a valid observable. Because we're rethrowing, we then need to catch the error again in the component. Another option is to catch the error and continue. So we just catch it to keep the observable from terminating and then continue along. In this case, it must return a valid observable of the appropriate type. And it is sometimes more difficult with that approach to get an error message to the user interface because we're not rethrowing to the user interface. And we'll look at some solutions for that. So we're going to start with the catch and rethrow scenario. So as we know, how to catch an error is with the catch error observable operator. What an observable operator does is it always takes in an observable. For the catch error, it takes in an observable that might emit an error notification. And then it outputs either the input observable. So if there's no error, it basically outputs from the operator the exact same observable that it took in. If an error occurred, it outputs a replacement observable. So we need to provide that replacement observable. Frequently, we give catch error a callback function that then handles the error, and it then returns a replacement observable in addition to optionally rethrowing the error so that the component is notified and it can display an appropriate message to the user. So this is what our handle error looks like for rethrowing the error. So it gives us the caught error. We can do what we want with it. We can parse through it, see what it is, create different messages depending upon what the error is. And then here we're creating the replacement observable and emitting that using throw error. It returns, this replacement observable returns an observable of never. So what the heck is that? It's basically an observable that emits no items to the observable and never completes. It's a simple observable that emits neither values nor the completion notification. It's simply used when an error occurs. So we emit that error notification. One of the nice things about observable of never is it helps retain our strong typing. What do I mean by that? Basically, here would be our code. So we've got our users dollar, our get, we catch the error, we handle the error. And here we've got our observable of never. So if we wanted to use something else, let's say we wanted to do an observable of, void, or if we wanted to do an observable of null, or we wanted to do an observable of undefined, what you would get then is when you hovered over users dollar, you would get observable of that type or user array. So you would have void, or you would have undefined, or you would have null, or whatever. By using never here, it doesn't muck with our, is that a word, muck? It doesn't muck with our data types. So we can return an observable of never, and our return data type is still observable of user array, and it doesn't muck with our type there. So catching and rethrow, we've already seen this code, users dollar, handle error. Then we need to catch it in the component. So we catch it in the component by issuing including in the pipeline another catch error observable operator. And here we can set a local variable that we can bind to in the template and display it for the user. And then here we're returning empty. So what's empty? Empty is a simple observable that emits no items and immediately completes. So it's a constant, and it's great for error handling when we don't have a real something that we want to emit. So our result is we get a message then in our user interface that we had some problem, but we probably should work on the display of what this message is. It's not very user friendly, but you get the idea of what's going on with this. Okay, so the next scenario is catch and continue. So the first scenario was catch and rethrow. Now we're going to catch and continue. So this, we have a little bit different UI that we're going to tackle here. In this case, we want to list all of the users. So we've got Leanne, we've got Irvin, and so on. If you scroll down, there would be all of them here, along with their tasks and completed. What we want to have happen is if there is an error getting one of these people, we want it to still continue and display the rest of them. So we want to get the data. So here we're getting all of the users. Then we want to get the related data, each user's to-dos. So we use merge map and fork join, and we loop through every user in that array of users that we get from our HTTP GET. And then we issue our GET request to get their to-dos. So here we're using their user ID in these to-dos. Then we emit the item as a user data, which is the user and their associated to-dos. And the fork join will put them all into a nice array for us. So what we get out of this is an observable of user data array with all of these items. So now that we have an outer observable and an inner observable, where do we put catch error? Do we put it here in the inside on the inner observable? If so, it won't catch any outer observable errors. Do we put it on the outside? Well, we could do that because it will catch errors from the inner and outer observable, but it then forces us to use the same error handler for both cases, which means it's going to stop that inner pipeline. So if this inner pipeline generates an error, it's going to stop and it's not going to finish. So it's not going to give us that array of user data values. It's just going to stop and that's going to be it. It won't even give us the data it had gotten so far, and it's going to go to the handle error, which is going to rethrow the error to the UI, and we won't get any users to-dos. We could then have catch error in both, and that would allow us then to potentially handle the error differently. In this case, I do have them both the same. And recall that when an observable generates an error, it stops and it won't emit further. So what are we going to do? We want to ensure that we get some data if there's an error. The answer is that we use catch and continue. You could tell I was leading up to that. So we're going to do catch and continue. So in this catch error, in this bottom one for the outer observable, oops, this guy here, we're just going to use the regular error handler, because if we can't get any users, we might as well throw an error and just put up one message. But if we can get all the users and we can get some amount of all of the to-dos, why not continue? So in this case, if there is some error, we're just going to assign that user that has the error an empty set of to-dos as our user data. That way we will get the rest of the values. So we return this replacement observable. So we're using of, which creates an observable from this entry. So that's our replacement observable that we're giving to catch error. Any issues with this approach? Well, if you look at it, it doesn't provide any mechanism at all for us to be able to notify the UI that we have a problem. So how would we get a notification? And it is really important with a user interface to know the difference between this user has no to-dos at all versus I couldn't get the to-dos for this user, because that's two incredibly different and importantly different things. So what we could do instead, we could get a message to the UI by adding a property to our interface. So here's our user, our array of to-dos, and we can add a message on there. Then when we set our property, our replacement observable, we set that message, could not get to-dos for whomever there. In the component then, we can set the message property to this message and bind it in the template. So the result would be something like this. So if we couldn't get Leanne, we'd get a message for her. So we know the difference between she has no tasks versus we couldn't get the tasks. But the rest of them continue down. I was trying to scroll, but the rest of them still go down. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is retry on error. I know for as a user of software, my husband and I sometimes run to Starbucks in the morning, and I start the order online while I'm in the house, and we get out to the car, and I'm down the street, and all of a sudden I lose connectivity. And luckily, the Starbucks app is smart enough to retry and reconnect, even though I just lost the connectivity from my Wi-Fi, and it picks up my phone's connectivity. So we might want to do the same thing. In order to retry, we can simply add retry and a number, which gives us the number of times to retry. So relatively straightforward. But if we want a smarter retry, we can use retry when. And here we replace the simple retry with this retry when, which defines exactly what you need and what you want it to do as part of the retry. So in this case, we're using scan in order to count. So we can count how many times we're retrying, and then we accumulate the counter. After 3 tries, we give up and we just throw the error. Otherwise, we accumulate, then we delay. The delay when uses an increasing delay between the retries. So every time through, we're multiplying the value times 500. So basically, we're increasing by a half a second every time we retry. This is sometimes called exponential backoff. So if you want a fancier retry, you can do something like that. Lastly, I want to talk about action streams. I kind of mentioned those earlier. So here I have a list of the users. I want to pick one and get that one user's data. So how do I implement this with RxJS? I can pick that one. The action is the user selects from the dropdown. So I'm going to define an action stream for that action. Then I'm going to react to that action and display the to-dos for the user. So I'm going to create an action stream, something like this, where the user selected a value, selected a user. And then I have the read-only part of that as observable. Then when the action occurs, when the user does select a username from that list, it's going to emit into that subject. And then it's going to react by going out and getting those to-dos. So this emits when a user is selected, and this goes and gets the to-dos for that user. Now, what's wrong with our exception handling here? If this code generates an exception, what's going to happen is with a handle error like this, where we catch and rethrow, this stream here, this observable, is going to shut down. So the next time, so it comes back and it says, okay, this user doesn't have any data, but the next time they try to pick a user, it won't pick a user anymore because the stream isn't working. It won't emit anymore into this. So what's one way to fix this? Well, one way to fix this is to use signals instead. But if you want to stick to observables, we need to change our error handling. Recall again that it will stop if it gets an error. We want to instead catch and continue, where we'll return just an empty array if we can't get the data, instead of rethrowing and causing our action stream to stop. And of course, so we're returning an empty array. And if we want to include a message, we could again use some kind of wrapper like we looked at earlier. Okay, with that, again, here's the link to the code. Here's the link to my YouTube channel. And I want to thank you all for hanging out with me and for attending this wonderful conference. Thank you so much.